The Futures journey of Northwestern University began in 2012 with the establishment of the Philippine Center for Foresight Education and Innovation Research, or the NWU Phil Foresight. The center sought to advance the awareness of futures thinking in the Philippines with a view of applying the tools of the discipline for strategic foresight, planning, and policy making. This began humbly with the introduction of futures thinking in the different courses of the university. 2 years after its establishment, NWU Phil Foresight, together with the UNESCO National Commission of the Philippines and the Luwag City government, organized Resilient Cities, Brighter Futures, a forum workshop on anticipatory thinking and strategic foresight methods for sustainable city futures. As a country frequently visited by devastating natural calamities, national and local leaders and policymakers, as well as leaders in industry, saw the importance of acquiring the anticipatory skills needed to provide the systems and infrastructure, reducing the loss of life and property brought about by these disasters. This Futures Literacy Forum workshop proved so useful that it was soon replicated in other parts of the country and in Southeast Asia. These efforts contributed to the establishment of the Asia-Pacific Foresight Network in 2015, with NWU Phil Foresight as one of the founding members. Hosted by Tamkang University in Taiwan, the conference was attended by futurists from the Prime Minister's Office of Singapore, the Prime Minister's Office of Malaysia, the Office of the President of the Republic of Korea, as well as academics from Tamkang University, University of Tehran, University of Sunshine Coast in Australia, Tokyo University, and the University of Hawaii. Back in the Philippines, NWU Phil Foresight continued to seek other avenues of using the futures and anticipatory thinking for the advancement of different advocacies and the resolution of pressing issues and concerns. NWU Phil Foresight organized an integrative foresight course for women city leaders entitled Transforming Philippine Cities, held at Vegan City, Ilocosur, as well as the Future of Food and Water and the World in 2025 at the Casino de Español de Manila. Finally, not to be left behind, Northwestern University has also utilized the futures thinking in crafting its long-term development plan through foresight-driven strategic planning. This has enabled us to effectively communicate the vision of becoming an autonomous world-class educational institution in our part of the globe to our stakeholders and implement our plans towards our desired objectives. With so much to learn and discover, and with so much at stake, it is our hope that futures and anticipatory thinking will become an essential part of all policy and decision-making in the public and private sectors, paving our way to a more secure and ideal future.
Good morning. I'm currently at the Asian Institute of Management in Makati, and thank you for joining us for the initial session launch of the Regenerative Futures 2050, a global symposium organized by the UNESCO Chair on Anticipatory Governance and Regenerative Cities at Northwestern University, Philippines, in collaboration with the Global South Futures community. Before anything else, allow me to give you a brief introduction of what this initiative is all about. So the Global Symposium on Regenerative Futures 2050 is an online symposium, aimed at envisioning pathways towards a regenerative futures world. Our intention is to bring together thought leaders, activists, futurists from around the globe to collaborate on imagining and sharing their insights and cases, ideas in creating sustainable regenerative futures and solutions for a thriving planet by 2050. The symposia will feature a variety of activities. Of course, it will not just be symposia as we normally see it, that involves activities like talks and panel or discussions. We would also, in the process, include workshops that showcases cutting-edge foresight and research methods and technologies, including community practices that promote regeneration in various sectors. So the ideas and insights that will be shared by our speakers, by the UNESCO Chair, and of course you, as a participant of this symposium, will culminate in a report to be published by the UNESCO Chair on Anticipatory Governance and Regenerative Cities at Northwestern University in collaboration with the Global South Futures community. We intend to capture the collective wisdom, scenarios, and strategies that will be shared for the entirety of the session that will end until probably like April of next year about regenerative future worlds. The special focus will be placed on several things. One is emergence. Second is decolonization, indigeneity, and perspectives from the Global South, ensuring an inclusive and equitable approach to regeneration. So our objective really is to facilitate a conversation that enables us, give us insights in crafting, visions. Crafting visions, build a community and network of, futurists and activists from around the world. And hopefully through the report, we're going to be using that, to share it with policymakers, local governments, national governments, to advocate and trigger a conversation about regenerative futures. And with that, let me just... And of course, knowledge sharing as well, and including, of course, building a community of, foresight scholars and practitioners who are involved and interested in regenerative thinking. So now let's get straight into the topic that we'll be discussing today. So our speaker is a good friend and a colleague at the Global South Futures community. Aliha Blackwell is the principal foresight strategies at Honoric Lab as our speaker. Blackwell, Aliha is currently the U.S. national lead for futures methods from around the world, where her interests surface from ancestral traditions of anticipation that includes, of course, dreaming and stargazing to inform pathways to alternative futures with migrant communities. Aliha also serves as a foresight affiliate, to the UNESCO Chair of Regenerative Cities and Anticipatory Governance at Northwestern University, and is a founding member of the Global South Futures community. As a cybersecurity fellow at New America, Aliha leads research on climate migrant rights, natural disaster surveillance technology, and global digital governance. Without further ado, Aliha, I now turn it over to you. And thank you very much for joining us. Good morning from Manila. Aliha, are you there? Just admit everyone. There are many. Okay, let me just admit.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes, Aliha.
Give me one moment as I share screen here. Beautiful. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Sherman, for inviting me to speak today. It's so beautiful to be in community with everyone and to be invited to provide a grounding and framing for the Regenerative Futures 2050 Symposium. When I first heard this question of how can Indigenous knowledge systems inspire decolonization in regenerative thinking and practices, I was really called to offer some ancestral guides for the uncertain times and provide more of a framing of some of the global trends that we'll be facing together. But before we go into that, I wanted to again just introduce myself. I'm Elijah Blackwell. I am the principal foresight strategist of the Oniric Lab. I am drawing on traditions today that come from my own ancestral lineages, growing up in Puerto Rico, growing up Black in Puerto Rico and non-binary, and with my family having roots in Colombia, across the Black Atlantic, which are inclusive of African, Caribbean, and American cultures. I come from a long tradition of stargazers, lucid dreamers, divination practitioners, herbalists, and street shamans. So today's talk will draw on all of these traditions in a non-linear way to share some of the emergent global trends and how they are in dialogue with ancestral lineages of resistance, of colonization as well. Before we get into the thick of the meeting and the content today, I'd really like to invite you all into a worldview that acknowledges that anytime we enter into community with one another, we are not only showing up as ourselves, but also welcoming all of our ancestors to be in community with us and to continue to allow for spirit to guide us. I'd love to take a collective breath, acknowledging this worldview here today that uplifts how fundamentally interconnected we are just through breathing. So we can take a breath now where as we breathe in, we draw in ancestral wisdom that lives within us and guides us on the molecular level and loves on us through it all. And as we breathe out, we're breathing out, the inspiration and imagination that's rooted in this ancestral wisdom to guide us through these times. And so here we'll just take one breath. And that was just, a practice breath, because if you noticed how your breath was moving through your body, if your breath stays in your chest, that usually means that your nervous system is very activated and that you're in a fight or flight mode or situation. And so I'd also invite you to take one hand, if you can, and put it on your belly and try to move your breath into your belly so that we can calm our nervous system as we enter into this. So one more time, let's breathe in the ancestral wisdom. Moving the breath into our belly, past the chest, calming our nervous system and releasing this breath with all of the inspiration, imagination that's rooted in this guidance that we hold within us everywhere we go, no matter what's happening in our built environments. I'd also love for you to put into the chat or say aloud to yourself, wherever you may find yourself, what ancestors are you calling on today that you'd like to invite into this conversation with us, or into your day or evening as we explore and resurface our own connections to ancestral homelands that we may have, we might find ourselves far away from nowadays. I know that that's my case and my reality. But I invite you to include in the chat any ancestors that you'd like to call on you with us as we explore these different conversations and streams of consciousness. I'd also like to ground our conversation in a land, labor, and life acknowledgement that's adapted from the Black Lives Matter Los Angeles chapter. And so here I'd like to recognize that I'm currently based in the United States in Los Angeles, and we recognize that the country of the United States was built on the stolen land of Indigenous people and the stolen labor and lives of our African ancestors. This land that I inhabit in what is so-called Los Angeles, California, is the ancestral homelands of the Tongva, Quiche, Chumash, and Gabrielino peoples. We can take a deep breath here again. We pay respect to all Indigenous peoples across past, present, and future generations and their continuing presence on their ancestral homeland and throughout the historical diasporas who continue to steward the land. And take a deep breath here again. We pay homage to those who were stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, falsely named as chattel, and forced into labor, who were called slaves but never submitted as such, who have always been fully human with an unbroken connection to the divine and to each other. We honor our African ancestors and for their still unpaid labor for what built what is now called the Americas. Take a deep breath here. To both our Indigenous and African forebears, we commit to the continuous struggle for liberation and reparations, for it is only through freedom and justice that we truly give honor, and so it is, Ashe. Thank you for helping us, really ground ourselves in this land acknowledgement, this land, labor, and life acknowledgement to help guide our conversation today. Just to give you a brief overview of some of the streams of consciousness that we'll be touching on in response to this question: how can Indigenous knowledge systems inspire decolonization in regenerative thinking and practices? We're going to really kind of play around with this tradition of call and response. And I love how this whole entire symposium, Regenerative Futures 2050, is a series of questions that are being shared with global communities across diasporas to draw on their own, ancestral traditions to answer these questions and answer this call. So we'll start off with thinking of, shared language and defining, some of the regenerative design principles that we'll be touching on before we go into the global trends that are forecasting some of the drivers of change and signals of the futures that we'll be facing, and we'll need to come up with very innovative and culturally rooted and responsive regenerative practices and solutions. Before we speak to some of the decolonial guides and how we can surface ancestral wisdom and practices for regenerative design to face, some of the upcoming trends and barriers and challenges that are unprecedented in their nature and scale. So here are a few of the regenerative design principles that we can touch on today. The first is regenerative design is life affirming. It honors both human and more than human, honoring nature and life while co-conspiring towards the flourishing of all and developing more nourishing infrastructures that allow for life-sustaining, life-affirming experiences to be had. Regenerative design is interdependent. It uplifts relational infrastructures of care rather than the extractive colonial transactional systems that we find ourselves in today and over the past generations. Regenerative design is biophilic. This means that it integrates nature into the designs from the beginning to ensure that infrastructure mirrors natural cycles and honors nature as it exists, in the world, and then accounts for that in the design rather than an afterthought. Regenerative design ensures that nature is considered upfront by design. And the final principle that I'll uplift today is decolonial. This is going to be a major theme throughout the Regenerative Futures 2050 Symposium, and absolutely is a core foundational principle of regenerative design, where we honor multiple worldviews of Black, Indigenous, and global majority communities who have historically been deemed peripheral to the design of, global collective governance infrastructure. We're changing that. We're reclaiming this through regenerative design principles. So we'll now explore some of the global trends and drivers of change through 2050 that will be presenting us with unprecedented challenges and changes, and countering these narratives with how we can draw on ancestral strategies for anticipating both future strategies and also ways that we can wayfind and navigate through the crises, the polycrises, the multiple crises that we'll be experiencing because of impending climate change, shifts that will lead to geopolitical upheaval, and other conflicts related to scarcity of natural resources. And so with climate migrations, will become emergent with increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters, and will continue to bear witness to the mass forced displacement of people due to climate change. Already, the United Nations has projected that by 2050, over 1.2 billion people will be forcibly displaced due to natural disasters. And currently, international human rights law does not protect people who are displaced from natural disasters with the same rights as asylum seekers or refugees from regions experiencing conflict. And we've already experienced, the global collective trauma of the various migrations that were happening throughout the global pandemic. And if we look at climate change, from a broader view and broader standpoint, a macro view, we see that pandemics are just a symptom of climate change that give us a glimpse based off of our own collective experience over the past few years. We can understand how there's such intense collective trauma that comes from these experiences that impact millions and billions of people all at once. So we have already seen the impacts today of colonial views of migration that stigmatize people who are searching for home through crises, and the historical legacies of maintaining borders with violence. The future is already happening in the Darien Gap, which is illustrated here in the map in the background. And the Darien Gap is the only strip of land that connects South America to Central America. And the migration journey is among the most deadliest, with more than 800,000 who may cross this year alone, coming from all over the world, from Haiti, Ethiopia, India, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ecuador, Venezuela, so many countries, in a journey north towards the United States. We are currently living in a reality where trying to, retrace whether it's, our ancestral migration patterns, or to find home and forge new migration patterns. This is something that is so deeply stigmatized, and a journey that's often lethal for climate migrants and for people who have been forcibly displaced from their ancestral homelands. And so through this work, we're really trying to understand how can we shift and apply a decolonial lens to migration, and understand migration from our own ancestral lineages to address this unprecedented forecast of the impacts that global mass migrations will have on our everyday realities and our infrastructure. So the first thing that surfaced for me, again, drawing on just intuitive practices, is that migration is natural. We can retrace our own migration patterns and migration journeys throughout our own diaspora, Black and Indigenous diaspora traditions. Coming from the Caribbean and being on my own migration journey from Puerto Rico to the mainland US and beyond, it's just been something that should be normalized, and something that should be reclaiming, our patterns and resurfacing medicinal plant knowledge and foraging to create transformative journeys of choice and of agency for climate migrants and people who are migrating due to the impacts of natural disasters, from hurricanes to landslides, earthquakes, and extreme heat. And so how can we really embrace migration through, border, and reimagine border management to be a portal through which we can realize a newfound sense of belonging, a newfound sense of home that connects us and allows us to build community in ways that we didn't even think were possible before. Another ancestral, tradition is thinking about solidarity infrastructure, and again, reevaluating the current infrastructure that exists and advocating for what has historically been advocated for by small island and developing states who have come up with, incredible blueprints that are forecasting how do we design climate justice and climate reparations that ensure that countries like the United States, Western countries who have contributed the most to today's environmental degradation, are able to allocate as many resources as possible to invest in a more life-affirming infrastructure of care that allows for climate adaptation, transformation, and mitigation, and reimagines, loss and damages beyond just thinking about one initial incident, a climate incident or climate event like a hurricane or another natural disaster, but also accounts for the profound impacts of forced displacement, like the loss of life, impediments to cultural preservation, the loss of biodiversity. How do we ensure that we're truly designing infrastructures that are able to hold us through unprecedented change and crises? And so this also raises how deeply traumatic forced displacement is due to natural disasters, and the ecological trauma and displaced collective grief that will arise, on a mass scale because of what it means to be uprooted from our homelands, and how this mirrors and reflects ancestral legacies, historical legacies of forced displacement due to slavery, due to attempted genocide, and due to other geopolitical conflicts and wars that have arisen in various regions of the world. And so the resurgence of collective healing rituals that are drawing on everything from, parties, dance parties. How can we use movement practices, traditional movement practices, to really work through and move the grief that we're experiencing through our body and have a collective experience? How will, protest be seen as places of, not only advocating for, different social justice, racial justice, and cultural transformation initiatives, but also how can it be a place of collective healing, collective grieving, to come in community with each other and to fight in solidarity for more liberatory infrastructures. There's also this resurgence of, wanting to tap into dreaming and folklore to give ourselves a sense of belonging. In my own practice and tradition, I first started lucid dreaming after experiencing, displacement due to hurricanes in Puerto Rico, and experiencing, a lot of nightmares and being afraid to fall asleep at night because I was so worried and anxious about, this natural disaster and what I saw, happen to my community, to the earth, to the land, and to places that, became unrecognizable almost because of the impact of various hurricanes. And so through that, dreaming became a practice that allowed me to reroute myself in ancestral wisdom, to connect with ancestors, to talk to and commune with, people and communities in ways that I wasn't always able to in my own built environment because I was in transition or migrating in different ways. So how can we resurface this practice of lucid dreaming to both simulate alternative futures and pathways and solutions to what we're seeing unfold in our built environment, but also use them as a portal to connect to our ancestors and to draw on, the experiences that have been felt within our own lineages. To me, coming from a Black Caribbean Jewish background, I've witnessed and heard, my own elders and community members speak to the experience of the war on drugs and civil war in Colombia, and how that impacted, displacement and their migration journey and their sense of belonging, while also, trying to resurface and understand, the intergenerational impacts of the transatlantic slave trade, from African Black ancestry, on my paternal side. And so there's just so much to draw on here in terms of all of the folklore that has surfaced and mythologies that have surfaced, where even in a time of crisis, we're able to shift, our gaze to dreaming of the stars, or reframing our own origin stories as being of elsewhere. I'm thinking of different mythologies that have, from the Dogon tribe, that have paid, homage and found home and belonging in the Sirius A constellation, and drawn on that as a way to, again, reflect on and dream of an alternative reality where we have a sense of belonging, even if it's not experienced, in our day-to-day life or in our built environment. It's something that we can draw on to resource us as we try to find and build community, to get to a more secure space, a more stable space, and understand how to move fluidly with the changes that we are facing. Another global trend that is surfacing is related to emerging technology. So in an effort to preempt some of the forecasted instability that will be drawn upon from climate migrations in the year ahead, and the different conflicts that will surface related to scarcity of resources, natural resources, and other, geopolitical conflicts, we'll increasingly witness emerging technology that's used to predict our movements, and how governments will increasingly rely on automated decision-making across institutions of governance and daily life, ranging from healthcare to finance to education, to practice this trend of automated predictive governance. So we'll be unpacking that a little bit more. I think that drawing on some of the origins of emerging technology is really helpful for understanding how to take a decolonial lens to this work, because of how colonial the origins of, something like the internet, or artificial intelligence is, where the internet, has its roots in the United States Department of Defense, emerging in the 1960s from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. And during this time, this project that's became the internet was used during the Vietnam War to track and monitor Vietnamese people, to inform military tactics and strategies, and identify patterns, and how Vietnamese people were moving and congregating, not only in the present, but also trying to understand how these connections could be drawn, in the future, by continuing this tracking and monitoring across generations. And the origins of artificial intelligence, similarly extend. Of course, there's been philosophers since before the 1950s who have thought about artificial intelligence. But if we talk about the modern term and where it came from, it was initially coined at Dartmouth Summer Conference in the 1950s, again in the United States, and was almost like the precursor to the internet, and helped to build those frameworks of machine learning, engineering, and artificial intelligence that were used during the Vietnam War as well, and informed some aspects of the internet's development down the line. And in the background here, we see this image of the North Atlantic undersea cables. And so this is the internet, the infrastructure of the internet here, these light blue lines across the Atlantic Ocean. And this maps on directly to routes of the transatlantic slave trade and the various ships that were traversing back and forth across the ocean. And so it's such a visual reminder and, reality of the colonial origins of this emerging technology and the ways that it's presented as, this magical, otherworldly, godly, almost like superpower of a gift, to be able to search on the internet or use artificial intelligence with ChatGPT or generative AI or these other, new tools that are emerging every single day. However, when we look behind, the curtain and we look at this, we can almost start to see how technology, modern technology today, is an extension of this broader colonial project. And that's not to say that, there hasn't been amazing impacts from the internet. Of course, we have global connections today. We're able to build community internationally, mobilize social and cultural movements online and on the ground. It's fostered so much continuous learning, virtually through mass open online courses and all of these different resources and platforms that have even allowed for the social and economic mobility of, different groups of people from all over the world who have been able to access this resource to build themselves and their community up in different ways. But with this emerging technology, we've also seen other impacts like misinformation and disinformation, and how targeted campaigns have relied on artificial intelligence or the mass monitoring and collection of data in order to inform who to target for various political destabilization during elections or during other contentious decisions that are being made at the community level or national levels as well. And so this has led to increased distrust in public institutions with the rise of mis and disinformation. And we've also seen the proliferation of a lot of surveillance technologies and a carceral architecture and digital infrastructure that's, again, used to monitor communications and target and put at risk, often, unfortunately, historically marginalized communities, members of the global majority and global South, human rights defenders and environmental defenders, activists and journalists who are most at risk of a lot of these technologies and tools that are used in the name of public health and safety and global and national security. However, we've already seen them have such disparate impacts on communities who too often bear the brunt of the harms of emerging technologies and social systems that aren't built with us in mind. And so those are some of the more technical impacts before we get into the social and climate impacts, where we see how this digital infrastructure relies on extractive relation and systems with nature in the mining of rare earth minerals that are causing wars and conflicts in different parts of Africa. We see water scarcity due to how it's needed, how much water is needed to store, how much water is needed to moderate, the data storage centers that are housing all of this data that's being collected from this mass monitoring and surveillance system that's often powered by AI. And of course, the internet. We see trends in exploitative labor, as well as gaps in digital and human rights to keep us safe as this technology is increasingly being embedded into our digital infrastructure worldwide. In order to counter some of these colonial trends and origins of emerging technologies that are increasingly facilitating our global digital governance infrastructure, we can draw on ancestral technologies that are using tools and strategies that merge both historical, traditional, and emergent technologies to root us in diaspora traditions. And so I've seen a lot of emergent projects from artists and creatives and game designers from Black and Indigenous diaspora traditions who are using emerging tech in ways that can help honor and return us to ancestral wisdom, traditions, and mythologies, from designing games that bring to life different cultural folklore and traditions to offer embodied ancestrally rooted experiences, even for folks who may no longer be on their ancestral homelands. They've been using, augmented reality and virtual reality to create immersive environments that mirror what it means, what it could be like to take part in different rituals, traditional rituals, and practices. And folks have also been creating large language models in an effort to advance cultural preservation of Indigenous languages or African American vernacular English or additional culturally specific dialects to, again, honor and preserve cultural traditions within technology that wasn't created with our communities in mind from the beginning. And so the ways in which we are bearing witness to the reclamation already of some of the colonial origins of this technology and adapting it, in our own cultural context has been really powerful and uplifting to see. Another opportunity is through collective digital governance. And so different trends that are drawing on Indigenous frameworks for data sovereignty and ensuring that the data that is collected from our communities are able to be modified, able to have a more communal practice of collective sense making of the data that's being collected from our communities in order to inform decisions about how we want to, develop neighborhoods or allocate resources through collective budgeting. And how this mirrors, different traditions and practices of cooperative movements, where we've had, sharing across cooperative movements that have drawn on food justice, that have drawn on land justice movements, and also worker, economic justice through cooperative worker-led movements and initiatives that, again, ensure that there's like a flat hierarchical decision making that can expand and be extended through digital platforms and governance mechanisms as well. A third kind of piece of this decolonial tech ecologies that have been emerging is also this initiative for regenerative technology and how we can be inspired by again, nature and biophilic design and the ways in which, for example, spiders, have their webs that they're able to both create a home, gather food. They have their home, they have their food, and they also have like this artistic expression that lives as a communication mechanism. A spider's web is a part of its collective, consciousness. It's a part of the consciousness of a spider. So when you touch a spider web and you get a chill, it's not just because of the weird texture. It's also because of the energy of all of the thought, all of the activity that is coming from this spider, and the home they've created, the transit system they've created, and how they carry this infrastructure within them everywhere they go. And so drawing again on biophilic design and biomimicry, there's been, the emergence of experiments that are rethinking infrastructure as not just, again, as we're migrating and we're traveling through, various regions, different landscapes, how do we have the tools with us to adapt to the climate that we are in, from clothing, that can transform into, a bed or another piece of home for us. These are all emergent tools and technologies that are drawing on, this ancestral practice of migration journeys, and the tools that we have carried with us to help guide us through various crises and unprecedented change. Another global trend that is being forecasted for 2050 and that we've already experienced in this decade and the decades preceding, are mass global protests and demonstrations against this rising authoritarianism and this backsliding of democracy that we're seeing worldwide. And so, here we go. Today, in 2024, we're experiencing this historic global election year, with elections being held in over 60 countries, with over 2 billion people who are voting, of course, all with varying degrees of access to being able to vote and have their vote, heard and counted. Unfortunately, that is the reality that we're living in. And over the past decade, there has been this backsliding of democracy, with this increase of public, distrust and mistrust of public institutions, and a growing dissatisfaction with governance structures, and legacies of harm that haven't been addressed, or there hasn't been significant accountability, or moves to repair in ways that feel authentic and have really brought about changed realities for impacted communities. And so, again, in the context of climate change and climate catastrophe, this will activate historical battles over natural resources, and climate will be another portal and almost like a narrative strategy to be used as a method for moving forward authoritarian agendas, again, being powered by the AI, automated decision-making systems and mass surveillance technologies that will be increasingly used to target protesters and journalists and folks who are thinking of alternative visions and alternative futures that look starkly different than a lot of the rising authoritarianism and backsliding democracy that they're seeing in their own homelands and in their own communities. So the question here is how might we draw on ancestral wisdom to guide us through social and political upheaval that takes us to lands we never even imagined visiting in our lifetimes in conditions that we didn't anticipate? Through this, I've drawn a lot of inspiration from encrypted crafts and stealthware, which uses fashion and makeup and artisanal tools to protect protesters who are subject to surveillance technologies by throwing off some of the ways that facial recognition technologies are able to identify or not various individuals. And so this draws on ancestral traditions of resistance that have that I've seen or heard of from my own elders and in my own communities around different ways that messages were embedded in quilts in the antebellum South of the United States during slavery, and how encoded messages were shared through these crafts of quilting, how even hair wraps and the different textiles and colors that were used were there to signal at different times whether or not a meeting was going to happen, to strategize around resisting colonization or resisting a plantation or different colonial and settler obstacles that we've had to face at various points on our migration journeys and across generations. And so this is just another glimpse into the future of how every movement to surveil and to control and to suppress is met by counter movements of resistance that are holding on to a vision that is liberatory, and that can transcend our present day realities through that consistent struggle for advocating for and demanding the justice that is deserved in different communities. Another strategy here has been using the collective visioning and the community building, the intercommunal ecosystems that are built. I don't know if you've noticed this trend in your own life, but whenever we're faced with unprecedented change or an obstacle that feels insurmountable, suddenly you find a shift along the way where you're met with such amazing and abundant community of people across disciplines, across backgrounds, who are resourcing you in different ways and almost like guides on your journey to really drawing on and carving out and fulfilling this vision that doesn't yet exist, but a vision that we hold dear within our hearts and within our minds and our souls, of what an alternative liberatory future looks like, that really honors and is life affirming of our existence. And so there's such powerful collective visioning and collective imagining and community building that happens within communities that are experiencing unprecedented change and are coming together to fight for an alternative future, an alternative present and reality, not only for present day community members, but also for future generations, and to reclaim what's been lost over the past generations. And so there's a lot of fertile ground here to reimagine governance structures and what we need to stay resourced through crises, and how we can build on these actions through community networks and community strategies for resistance and resilience that are drawing on our own traditions and practices that we may have been steeped in. And as we close, I see I'm coming up on time here. I just wanted to offer this archetype of the ocean, which represents the unconscious, the depths, the incomprehensible. And the power of the ocean is unmatched. To step into its salty waters is to step into the unknown. By its sheer volume, the ocean represents the unconscious, all that is beyond our understanding. We cannot live within the ocean. We cannot claim it, manage it, or own it. It rejects our every attempt to dominate nature. Yet, amid its overwhelming power, it calls to us, inspires us, and invigorates our life on land. It dissolves the little us into the big us. When the energy of the ocean is present, there is change stirring that is beyond any change you've known before. The ego must dissolve. The saline swells, work on your very cells, your fibers, your deepest underlying beliefs. Like Aphrodite, we rise from the ocean's froth, a new beginning. Life is change. Let the wave crash. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your visions and the ancestral lineages that you've drawn upon to help guide you through uncertain times, and what you foresee on the horizon.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Aliyah, for the wonderful, presentation and insight to share about regeneration in the context of futures foresight, and accentuating, the angle by which, what would the narrative of the future look like, and then linking this to some of the several issues that are, influencing the way we perceive, potential and alternative future possibilities in the context of decolonization is pretty quite, it's not really pretty quite, I think it is compelling, in the sense that, it gives us, an understanding that there are different ways of, perceiving, imagining, and interpreting what the future entails and what it means, at least from a decolonial perspective, using your context. And what I've seen from your presentation is that it also reminds me about, the need to question, in fact, the way we perceive futures today. Of course, there are, several ideas that we've learned over the years, and in fact, as a practitioners, applied them as well including the knowledge base that informs these things, like, for example, strategic foresight, the loss of the future, among other things, that the future is invisible or unknown. So looking at from the perspective of a decolonial view, it appears that the future isn't actually invisible at all, right? That the future isn't just a temporal marker wherein we put time horizon and try to create some goals and targets and plans and try to achieve it and conquer and in the context of conquest, and dominate it, right, to achieve our goals, among other things. It questions that idea or perception that, in fact, the future is invisible. Now, from a decolonial perspective, the way you presented it, the insight that I got was that the future isn't actually invisible or unknown at all, because when we enter the future, we carry the memory of the past, right? So there are cultural, drivers. We don't. Probably, perhaps it's wrong to even call them as drivers of change. I would say that they are vital forces of change, because when we envision the future from a colonial view, it is not blank, right? There is culture in this. Yeah. So what do you think about it? Like, it directly runs contrast to the idea that the future is invisible and therefore something that we can actually define because it is open, it is blank, But then in the context of a decolonial idea of the future, what you're saying is that you're trying to, in fact, as far as I see it, is that, you have history, you have the shared history, you have this ancestral wisdom, and then you carry these things with you in envisioning the future.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the future is very black. When I think of this tradition of stargazing, and at staring, deeply into the night sky, to the point where you're almost overwhelmed with a sense of longing, to be in community with, these lights, these dazzling lights in the sky, that we know are a part of us. Stars are part of us at the molecular level. And so when we look longingly at the sky, we're looking longingly at our celestial ancestors, at, all who have transcended, from this earth and are now in another dimension, and still, lovingly guiding us through it all. There's so much, the shapes that we make out of darkness, to me, is so fundamental and core to, foreseeing, for hearing. I've been reflecting on how, often in a Western context, we value sight over the other senses, let alone even acknowledging intuition as a valid guide. And so how can we, lean into the darkness and see and intuit, I guess I should say, what's on the horizon, what's coming to us, because I think that there's so much that reaches out to us as we start to expand our consciousness and shift the collective gaze from, technology or a screen and onto nature, and really doing that deep listening, and practicing that can give us such profound insights about where to go, what to do next, or what to sit with, and learn from. And so, I mean, I completely agree with this notion of retrieving from the past, drawing on different historical traditions and practices, embodying those in the present, and repatterning, and continuing these different methods and pathways and practices, to navigate through what we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and what we are anticipating ahead.
Yeah. So again, for our friends out there, like, if you have some questions, comments, and feedback, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will try to bring this to Aliha. There's a comment here that repatterning is critical, right? Yeah. In fact, about that, this leads me to as well, question the current frameworks that we're currently using. Of course, we know this, that these are frameworks that has been developed and designed, invented by our colleagues, doing foresight in the West, in a Western perspective, in a Western way of knowing, in the Western way of practice, right? Like, for example, the Futures Cone, right? So the future cone, definitely leverages on the present. And in fact, it is evident that in the Futures Cone, the past isn't actually like apparent, in that cone. And then I've seen this framework, that was also shared by our colleagues who are doing, futures and foresight, in Africa, is that apparently the way the indigenous communities, at least in how you decolonize foresight, at least in that part of the world, in Africa, is that there are alternative past, alternative present, and alternative futures, right? So it is the future apparently is not really like vertical, linear, or even horizontal, whatever you might call it. It seems to suggest that the future is actually pluriversal, that emerges from from experiences. What do you say about that? Any comment?
I mean, it's drawing to my mind this image that a South African futurist presented on, that was again reimagining the Futures Cone, and again drawing on this idea that there's many past, many presents, many futures, and presented time, presented it almost like as this series of nonlinear spiralic connections across these various kind of elements that were reflecting the past, the many presents, the many futures, and the journey across time, and how all time lives at once, as we remember or are living in our memories, recalling our dreams or something from the past. We revisit that moment in time, and we are transported there in different ways. And so there's just so much power in acknowledging time as nonlinear, acknowledging healing, what it takes for transgenerational healing as a nonlinear process, and looking at different cycles in nature as another portal through which we can shift our relationship with time, because again, time is one of the most surveilled elements among us. I don't know how often you watch the clock, or how I'm thinking about how even in plantations, time was used as a mechanism to again reinforce this colonial power dynamic, and so there's just so much there to unravel, and to unpack with how we honor all that time is, this pluriversal worldview, and how we can hold many truths without tripping up too often.
Okay, thank you for the comment. There are very interesting comments here, right? Like we have different relationship with time, our constructs of it, our conceptualization, and therefore how we relate to the future and the past, and how we frame and represent. Yeah,
beautiful.
I totally agree with that. Thank you for that comment. Now, given that you have actually touched upon the issue of migration and how climate change is actually influencing the way migration is in fact emerging, and here's the thing. One research that I've read about the issue of climate change, right, and connecting this in the context of colonization. Right, I learned in one of the research written by one of the members of the IPCC was that it took the International Panel for Climate Change 30 years to acknowledge colonialism in its reports. Today, after 30 years, the IPCC now identifies colonialism as a key factor in anthropogenic climate change, and it highlights, its role in creating disproportionate impacts on various communities worldwide. So apparently there is history into this, right? Like it doesn't just pop up because everyone like now talks about it as a matter of public policy. So they're looking into the history of why climate change exists in the first place, and it's a result and outcome of the last 500 years, right? And it's not just the last 20 or 30 years.
Right.
It's really quite surprising, right? Like colonialism, hasn't been acknowledged at all as one of like anthropocentric causes of climate change.
Right. I mean, I think that just goes to show how much the conversation on climate change is being led and shaped by a colonial worldview, where again we're focused on almost these scientific and mathematical models and projections, which are very important. All of these various milestones with KPIs and everything connected to them are very important. And at the same time, I'm sure if you asked so many different, communities, Black and Indigenous communities, what they saw was, what we see as the root cause of climate change, we would absolutely point to colonial settler dynamics and these histories and these legacies, and how they've completely transformed our landscape and waterways and foodways, our ways of life, our cultural traditions, how connected, what a sense of belonging we feel or don't, no matter where we are. And so I think that there's just so much work to do to, again, center decolonial worldviews in this conversation around climate, even in reflecting on, climate migration and how it's being forecasted as one of the leading causes for the largest forced migration. I'm always reflecting on my ancestors and the forced displacement from the transatlantic slave trade that was, to this day is still one of the largest, if not the largest, I think, global forced mass migrations in recent history. And so there's so much to draw on how we resisted, how we survived, how we remained, resilience, and we're able to retrieve, our traditions, different practices of even braiding seeds, from our ancestral homelands into our hair before being forced on this journey. And so I think that there's so much to draw on from our own lineages to really start to, again, reimagine and dream of alternative pathways to more equitable and just and liberatory futures.
We have several minutes left, and then suddenly, this thought props up in a conversation that I had with Zia Sarda. And of course, this is pretty quite evident in most of his writings. And, this question is, associated mostly with Zia, right? Like the question, pretty quite simple, but really like compelling, right? Is the future colonized, right? That was his question. But then, in a session that I had with him, we went back to his question about whether or not the future was colonized. Of course, that is something that you need to unpack, right? Many are saying, UNESCO chairs, of course, colonization is the elephant in the room, right? It is apparent in everything that we do, in the systems, in the governance, in the legal landscape, among other things. It's like you can treat it as either your white elephant or a black elephant, right? So, but then here's the thing, Sia said that, and then of course, connecting as well with some friends from Latin America, who's been saying that, okay, the future isn't colonized, it is decolonized, right? And then, in fact, that is something that you need to put some effort into it. How do you actually exactly decolonize the future? And in the context of regenerative thinking, what would it look like? What would it mean to actually decolonize the idea of regeneration? In fact, if you even need to decolonize it, because regeneration as an idea is nature-based, which is inherent and implicit, to the way of knowing worldview of indigenous people.
Right. Again, drawing on this idea of there being many past, many presents, and many futures, it seems like what's been surfacing is this notion that every moment in the present is this opportunity to, reclaim and fight for, justice for past generations who never were able to experience it to the extent that, we would have dreamed or imagined, and how we can carry those seeds, towards more liberatory futures with us through our present day actions and movements, for future generations as well. And so using this present moment as both, this opportunity to redress, these legacies of harm from the past, reclaim, the resources, the traditions, the practices, and continue to breathe new life into them to, again, pattern and repattern, weave together, new traditions with old ones, and continue just, yes, breathing, continue breathing, continuing to return to breath, continuing to return to these practices that keep us rooted in traditional and communal abundance.
Yes. And in fact, going back again, to the conversation that I had with Zia, I recall that he said that perhaps there is a need for us to actually go back to our, indigenous metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
That's what he said, right? Like you have to go back to your, indigenous knowledge and study it, right? And then, you might be surprised by, what you would, unpack and uncover and discover, in the process
Absolutely.
of studying your own indigenous metaphysics. And not only that, the way I see it is that I think language is also essential and critical in terms of reimagining the way we do foresight today. Because foresight apparently is too interested in the strategic stuff, right? Like foresight, strategic thinking, those types of foresight that are utilitarian in context, right? It's something that
Right.
you can use the future as a tool, resource, and asset to change today, right? Is there
Right.
beyond foresight that goes beyond the conception of use and utility, which is, of course, a colonial idea. And in fact, which leads me to think about, the future of foresight in the context of relationality. Any thoughts about that, Aliha, about, the idea of, embarking in exploring ways by which, we can reimagine the way we do foresight today by accentuating the concept of relationship and relationality, not just between humans, but, animals, plants, birds, nature, rivers, rocks. Your thoughts about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's so much that we've been conditioned to see as normal. There's so much, there's so many extractive, transactional practices and systems that we've been exposed to. And I've been having different conversations around like healing and what it takes to build intergenerational healing infrastructure, and think about, even policymaking or different governance structures in this framework of how do we evaluate, these longer term impacts of decisions that we're making today, or decisions that have already been made, that we are inheriting today. And through that, it's been this, again, journey of nonlinear, cyclical conversations and storytelling, and trying to find different ways to follow these rhythms and follow these patterns, despite and in the face of everything in our systems and in the dominant worldview that we're living in, that tells us that building relationships with each other, that giving to each other, that practicing and honoring interdependence, not only, of course, between communities, but also in community with nature, in community with, the elements. There's it's like a muscle that needs to be built, where every time that we, practice caring, that we practice, showing up for each other, and we practice being in solidarity with different movements for justice, for liberation, that we are able to, again, chip away at this dominant, Western colonial system, and start building these relational infrastructures that ultimately, are clearly going to be what helps keep us safe, what helps us care for each other through crises and unprecedented change. When natural disasters hit, when power lines go down, when we're facing all of these different challenges, the first people who we look to are probably not going to be our governing, structures from experience. They're going to be, our family, our chosen family, and people who we're in direct community with. So building out those infrastructures, and that relational infrastructure is so critical to being able to not only, recover, but also to be able to flourish and thrive and build these new models that don't rely on, centralized systems of power that we've seen time and time again, be corrupted or not be designed, with us in mind or centered, and instead, redesign around our communities, and building, these decentralized networks of care that can power us through whatever is to come.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are many wonderful comments and questions in here. Let's just try to respond to at least one question, and then probably, perhaps, I can send this to Aliha, and Aliha can, respond to your questions by email. We can do that. But let me just at least, there's an interesting comment here, right? Like, the 2050 global trend is both alarming and positive because we can actively shape it, as I believe that recognizing the problem is already half the battle won. And anyway, this might be a little off topic, but when you talk about lucid dreaming, do you mean that you actively practice it? Are you able to tell yourself that you will go to sleep and enter a lucid, let me just, what's that? No, I'm sorry, I'm lost. And I can find it's kind of like, sorry about this. Can you see it?
I have it open here. Do you mean that you actively practice it? Are you able to tell yourself that you will go to sleep and enter a lucid dream state? How does it actually work? How does one get started with it? Okay. Yes. So when I talk about lucid dreaming, it's a practice that I've been doing for many decades now. And it all started again with this experience of being displaced due to hurricanes in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, and in Florida. And so this practice for me came from, yes, at first going into this state, and having almost, a nighttime ritual where I would prompt myself with, and root myself with reminders that, I'm about to go to sleep. I'm about to go, into the astral realm, into this dreamscape, and reminding myself that I have agency and that I have power, to shape my dream, so that I may sleep and rest peacefully, in case it was a nightmare or anything along those lines. And so initially that's how it started, with those affirmations. But over time, I've been able to automatically enter into a lucid dreaming state almost every time that I dream. And sometimes I'm just an observer in my dream. Sometimes I'm playing a more active role, in shaping the outcomes and simulating the space or the conversations. And other times, dreaming feels something completely out of one's control. It feels like, something that instead takes over me. and I'm being guided through my dream to connect with, different ancestors, with different beings, with different communities, and to learn. And, whether, I think I always believe in, an active nightlife that mirrors, our day-to-day life, and that's something that's very inspiring, something that helps resource me in different ways at different points. But yeah, I think that lucid dreaming, you can get started by trying to just, again, prompt yourself before you go to sleep at night, reroute yourself in this idea that you have agency to shape the narrative in your dream, and also to start documenting and writing, these different practices that do or don't work for you, or when you do wake up and you remember, a glimpse of your dream, try to write that down or carry it with you in different ways, give a voice note if that's quicker or easier. Just find different rituals that you can do before you go to sleep and when you wake up that help you become more aware. That's the first step, is raising an awareness that when you go to sleep at night, you are dreaming. You have the potential to dream. And so how do you want to use this time of night to surface, different parts of yourself, to talk to different aspects of yourself, to process different parts of your day, to imagine alternative origin stories and histories, and to dream of different futures. There's so much to do in our dreams, and there's so much freedom, to be found there that we don't always have access to in our daily lives.
Yeah, it reminds me as well of several tribes, indigenous communities in the Philippines. They have, of course, I think this is also, it's kind of like a practice, usually all around the world, by diverse indigenous communities, like dream weaving, right? As a matter of practice, right? Like weaving is a practice. And one community in the Philippines, at least in the part of Mindanao, they have this, they're called dream weavers, right? So the process of dreaming is actually in the weaving, right? So their state of dreaming are manifested in the weaving, right? So and you're just surprised and amazed by the outcome, and the meaning of these dreams that are manifested in the cloth, in the weave, right? Like, yeah. So that could be one practice as well. There are many ways by which indigenous people actually practice dreaming, right? Like, dreamscapes, right? Those kinds of stuff. And also, Aliha, I think there was a question that was related to this, is as what you've been saying, is that it is necessary for us to reclaim ourselves, to reclaim our ways of imagining the future. There is need to acknowledge the trauma and find ways to actually heal that trauma,
right,
caused by a traumatic past, right? Simply because cultures, our cultures, indigenous cultures, and local communities were devalued, really, like, so much,
right?
And, in fact, because of that devaluation in their ways of knowing, in their knowledge systems and practices, they've been labeled as superstitious, right? There is prior history to these traditions thousands of years ago, and colonizers did not know anything about it. They knew nothing about the histories that actually build these practices for thousands of years, and eventually they will label them as something wild or barbaric or something like that, because they couldn't understand it themselves, right? And these were devalued significantly in the last 500 years. And I think now we do have the opportunity to actually reclaim that, not actually rediscover it, but reclaim it by studying this. And when we study them, we see the value of relationality in foresight. Like, for example, the way you said it, like in the aspect of dreaming, right? As the case that you just presented, there is this she is not a futurist, but her work is into futures, in fact, right? Futurism, but not necessarily in the domain of how futurists and foresight practitioners looks at future studies, right? But in the context of anthropology, in the context of indigenous systems, right? And then what she was saying is that when you can practice those kinds of ways by which we can dream the future, is that it accentuates and builds what she called relational sovereignty with ourselves and with our communities, right? She called that radical sovereignty. She was saying that we don't need permission, from others to actually like practice this practices or rituals or whatever you might call it that gives us meaning, right? You don't need permission from anyone. And embracing this concept of relational sovereignty, gives you the agency to actually discover the future with full autonomy and self-determination. Yeah. So that was a wonderful, view. She's not a futurist the way we see ourselves as futurists, but I would say she's really into futures and foresight, in fact, but in a different dimension, right?
Absolutely.
Which is
absolutely
should inform the way we do foresight today, right? So any concluding words from you, Aliha, before we close this?
Just again, thank you so much again for inviting me to share more of some of these framings for this Regenerative Futures 2025 Symposium. I think that this is going to be a really powerful series of conversations, and I hope that we continue to build this community and to reflect on and build communities of practice around how we can draw upon our own ancestral traditions and lineages to help us be resourced with the tools and the practices and the guides to wayfind through everything that is to come.
Thank you very much, Aliha, for that. Really appreciate the thought that you put into this. We're going to continue the conversation, and the apologies for not being able to respond to all the questions, but we'll do our best to actually respond to them via email, or perhaps you can reach with us out. We can talk, in the process. Let's see what's possible. Now, the next session will be on September 27 next month. So we're going to have like a once-a-month conversation about this. And of course, when we talk about, decolonizing regenerative thinking and practices, you need to have some sort of a system that allows or enables it to thrive, right? So we're gonna have a conversation of, how can cities be redesigned, our communities to support regenerative living and practices. So our next speaker will be Tony Hallahan, who's currently based in Australia. And we will learn more about how our friends in Australia, share their cases and insights on how they actually build and encourage and advocate regenerative living and practices in urban settings and urban landscapes. So again, thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.